Just give you the data in the U.S. There's about 3 million companies selling B2B. For most of those companies, is their main competition their competitors or the status quo? So for most, it's actually the status quo. And so the great salespeople understand that, and they understand what it takes to overcome the status quo in buyers' minds. And the average salespeople don't. They just keep on plugging away.
Hello, Sales Nation. I'm Will Barron, host of the Salesman.org podcast, the world's biggest B2B sales show, where we help you not just hit your sales target, but really thrive in sales. Let's meet today's guest.
Hello, gang. I'm John Asher, author of Close Deals Faster. And for us, time is money. Close deals faster.
In this episode with John, we're diving into how we can close deals faster. Clearly, if we can close deals faster, we can close more in the same amount of time and smash our sales targets. And importantly, Sales Nation, we're diving into the science behind all of this. What we need to do to light up when we're doing experiments on our potential customers, how to light up their brains, get their serotonin going, their dopamine going, and how to really make them make a decision, essentially, far quicker than we otherwise would be able to. And so let's jump right in. What is the most common thing that perhaps most of us would do in the B2B sales professionals that listen to this show? What's the most common thing that needlessly lengthens sales cycles in the B2B world?
Most companies have what's called a clogged pipeline, and there are many reasons for it. One of the biggest one is, just give you the data in the U.S. There's about 3 million companies selling B2B. For most of those companies, is their main competition their competitors or the status quo? So for most, it's actually the status quo. And so the great salespeople understand that, and they understand what it takes to overcome the status quo in buyers' minds, and the average salespeople don't. They just keep on plugging away.
What does it mean, John? And this is going to sound like a ridiculous question, but I'm going to ask it. For perhaps someone who's new to sales, what does it mean that we've got to overcome the status quo?
So in other words, in many buyers' minds, it's trying to get them to make the decision. And if you're going to, if we're after an opportunity where the buyer is unhappy with their current provider, vendor, supplier, then we have a real chance. But if the buyer is happy or okay with their current provider, very difficult to get them to change their mind. And when you go back and look at all these latest neuroscience studies, the stimuli that wake up the buyer's brain, the cognitive biases, one of the main biases is called the status quo bias. So all of us are conditioned to stick with what we've got. And there's 3 main reasons it's difficult to get buyers to shift. One, there's switching costs. They may have an inventory of the current provider's products. 2, all buyers know that change is difficult. Even good change hurts. And 3, buyers just won't shift for a 4% improvement. And so you've got to have a significant ROI for the buyer. And in today's world, with look at the data from the big technology and outsourcing companies, Deloitte, PricewaterhouseCoopers, KPMG, et cetera, doesn't matter what financial metric you're talking about, higher revenue, higher cash flow, higher gross margin, lower costs, you must have at least a 15% improvement or buyers just won't shift. So it's those 3 issues you've got to address to get most of the buyers to change to you.
And is this, because I guess there's 2 ways we could play this. We could go, right, these individuals are going to be difficult to change their minds, change their perceptions. We'll put them on the back burner and we'll just go after the low-hanging fruit. Is that the moral of the story here? Or is the moral of the story, I guess, forget the moral of the story, what do high-performing salespeople do? Do they triage perfectly the sales leads and only spend time with people that are more likely to close? Or do the high-performing salespeople have the ability to change minds on switching costs, the difficultness of it, the big ROIs? Are they able to break through those barriers?
Well, it's going to sound a little trite, but both. And so one of the things that will really separate elite from average salespeople is, average salespeople go after a lot of prospects and give them a few touches, like a shotgun, where the elite salespeople will focus like a laser beam and really qualify the buyers. And of course, one of the few questions that you really got to know is, are they happy with their current provider? That's number one. So if they're unhappy, we got a real chance. This is easy. If they're unhappy, if they're happy or okay, this is going to be difficult. The second thing that almost all elite salespeople want to know is, do we have an inside coach? And that comes from the Miller-Hyman training, where a famous training class in the U.S. based on the book Strategic Selling. And the coach is that person inside the company into which you're trying to sell, who knows you, like you, trusts you, wants to help you get the business. So they're like coaching you on how to get the business like a football coach would. So when you've got opportunities where you have the inside coach who can quickly tell you whether the opportunity is valid or not, if they can tell you it is valid, then you're on the right path. So it's that qualification, having the inside coach and understanding how to upset the status quo.
And there seems like there's a gap here between asking someone on the phone, you cold call, are you happy with your, and this is what a cheesy salesperson in the 80s who's selling utilities would probably ask, but are you happy with your current provider? Clearly in a B2B context where the deal size might be 100 grand, it might be multiple millions. In my background in medical device sales, I'd be doing deals from one camera system for 50 grand to full operating theaters for multiple millions and kind of contracts going along the side that of millions a year. It's very unlikely I'm going to get on the phone with a surgeon and go, are you happy? And they're going to give me some kind of response. So is there a element of, before we can do this deep qualification, there has to be some lighter qualification to, again, stop this sticky or clogged pipeline that you kind of alluded to at the top of the show?
Yes. And there's a couple of other these cognitive biases that apply to this. One's called the negativity bias. So we all remember negative things that happen to us 5 times more than we remember positive things. So negative things that happen to us really stick in our mind. Another one of these biases is called the confirmation bias. Once we make a decision, we like to stick with it. And sometimes you'll hear this in sales training classes called the staircase to yes. So if you can get the buyer to say yes to a few small things, when it gets time to ask for the real deal you want, the probability of getting that deal goes up significantly. So let's apply this to asking the buyer how happy they are. If you ask most buyers, are you happy with your current provider? They'll say something, because of the confirmation bias, they'll say something like this: yeah, things are going okay. But if you ask the buyer, on the other hand, what do you like about your current provider? They'll tell you a few things they like and then immediately shift to the negative. And now we get to know what we need to know. So it's all about knowing how to ask because of those two biases.
And are there any specific questions we should be asking? Any more intelligent questions than perhaps, what do you like about your current provider? Because again, that sounds not very consultative and a little bit false and off a script, right?
Well, you wouldn't necessarily ask that as the opening question. So, when you watch great salespeople at work, there's really for them, now they're meeting with the customer or talking on the phone. There's really a 3-step process. One is build rapport. So get the buyer's cards off the chest so they will share their stuff with you. 2, do a needs analysis so you can figure out what the buyer needs. And then 3, of course, as appropriate, offer a solution that fits. So if you really have taken advantage of some of these cognitive biases that are all about rapport building, and the buyer feels great about the salesperson, then they'll answer those questions.
And it seems, tell me if I'm wrong here, but it seems a lot of this psychology is perhaps working against a salesperson if the person that we're speaking to, if their incumbent supplier is doing okay, if they're plodding along. Does this then double down the emphasis on jumping on change with an organization? So obviously someone can't have confirmation bias on a previous supplier if they're brand new to the job. Is this double down on the fact that we should be looking out for things like trigger events?
Of course, absolutely right. Because those are real opportunities when you can find those trigger events. And in many cases, that's what marketing companies are all about. Doing research, watching press releases, what company bought another company, all those things that change in the marketplace. Those are those trigger events that alert salespeople that there's a potential opportunity here.
Perfect. And John, what are we doing every day? What are we doing that's perhaps not as obvious as what we're talking about here? What subtle things are we doing that perhaps are sabotaging our attempts to not just close the deal? Perhaps the deal is going to close, but we're needlessly lengthening it without having to what extra steps are added to the process that we don't need to have in there, perhaps?
Well, let's kind of drop back for a second, and I'll give you a little bit of a bigger picture to answer that question.
Sure.
And that is sales for decades, maybe even a century, have been based on, for sales guys like you and me in the audience, have been on stuff we've learned, advice from our boss, books we've read, maybe motivational speakers we've listened to. And there's always been an art and a science to sales. The science is have a sales process and follow it. The art is all of us are different personalities. How we achieve each step in the process, we could do differently because we're different personalities, which is okay as long as you follow the process. That's the best process for closing a deal. Now things have changed. We now know the science behind how to be a much better salesperson. And the new science upsets what many of us have thought was the right thing to do in sales. So to give you an example, there's been in the last 5 years a worldwide forum of neuroscientists sharing their studies, their research with all others in this worldwide forum. And if you ask these neuroscientists, and by the way, in the last 3 years or so, many of these studies are done with what are called functional MRI machines. So imagine somebody sitting in a chair with a helmet with an MRI machine built in. So as you try various techniques on them, you can see what areas of the brain light up, what don't, when two different, like the dopamine and serotonin circuits both light up at the same time and that sort of thing. And if you ask these neuroscientists, why are you guys doing this? They'll say, other than academic reasons, we're really looking for insight into human communications, human relationships, rapport building, decision making. And if you ask these neuroscientists, well, how does this apply to sales or marketing? They'll say, well, what do you mean by sales and marketing? Or you'll get a blank stare. So our company's job in the last 3 years has been so there's 7 of us, we're all partners, we're all engineers. So the 7 of us have, in the last 3 years, taken a look at all these studies. We've cataloged 100 cognitive biases, 50 of which apply to sales. We haven't discovered anything. We've integrated from the studies the 6 stimuli that will wake up the buyer's whole brain. And so if you're with a suspect, prospect, or current customer, and you're not using one of the 6 stimuli to wake up the buyer's whole brain, closing rates would be 0. And so many of these cognitive biases apply to all aspects of the sales cycle, including maybe the most important, rapport building. Because I'm sure you've heard many of the motivational speakers, maybe the late great Ziegler used to say it, maybe the best, and that is they may buy you and not your product, but they ain't buying the product without buying you first. So that's why rapport building has always been so important, and we now know it's even more important from all these studies. So if you meet somebody in person now, we now know they look at our face and they give a yes or no decision in 0.07 seconds. So the whole idea of the first impression is as important as you've always heard it, and it happens faster than we ever had imagined that it happened. So there's a bunch of these cognitive biases and old brain stimuli that apply to the rapport building that'll get the buyer to like you, fast.
So John,
if you can get that step done, then the other steps are pretty easy.
Other than an ugly bastard like myself having some kind of surgery to increase that initial rapport building by getting my nose probably shortened and some cheek implants on there, what are the 1, 2, kind of 3 top stimuli that we need to be, I guess, conscious of, and then we can work down from the science to the practical application of it and how we can implement some of this as well?
Let's take the first old brain stimuli. It's called me focused. And this comes mainly from the reptilian brain, part of the old brain. So the old brain is the reptilian brain and emotional brain. And so in other words, if a salesperson is giving a presentation and the presentation architecture sounds like this, here's the vision of our company. Here's a picture of the executive team and our facilities. Here's a list of our 7 integrated cybersecurity solutions. Let's start with the details of cybersecurity solution number one. How about the buyer's old brain? Will, is it awake yet? No hope.
It's because I can visualize that, and I've probably done it myself in the past. But I can
Of course.
visualize that's the standard layout for a presentation.
Yes. So to give you a little bit of an idea on the salespeople in the U.S., there's about 25 million B2B and B2G, B to government, business to government salespeople in the U.S. The latest Harvard study shows that 5 million are elite and 20 million are not very good. And the turnover rate for salespeople in our country is 37% per year, mainly because of lack of talent for sales or lack of training. So when you watch a great salesperson give a presentation, now think me focus. The buyer's only concerned about itself. Their first slide the title of it will be, here is our understanding of your needs. And these latest functional MRI studies from Harvard show that in 95% of the cases, it causes a big conversation. And after that conversation is over, how many slides in our slide deck of 21 slides do we have to show? Not too many. So that's a practical application of the latest neuroscience studies and an example of the first old brain stimuli.
It seems like this is ridiculous, but as we're talking about it, I feel like me and you could go deeper into this subject, and it might be a conversation for another time, John. But it seems like we should invite people into our offices. Each of the seats should have some kind of movement recorder on it, and as people lean forward in their seats, the salesperson, I don't know, just carries on going. Every time the audience leans back or starts fidgeting, the salesperson gets electrocuted. It seems like there's an opportunity for, and obviously it's a ludicrous example, but there seems like some kind of opportunity with technology in the future to give real-time feedback. Or maybe I'm overcomplicating this because people's faces are real-time feedback. But for people who are less adept at reading faces for whatever reason, it seems like there should be a way to process some of this and give the salesperson not even a leg up, just an opportunity to shine, right? Is this... Can we do a fMRI on an audience? Or is it, I guess it's so invasive right now that would be totally impossible, right?
Well, we do a lot of training in China, and the Chinese are crazy with social media. So when I'm giving a presentation in China, I'm getting real-time feedback from all of their WeChat messages that are shown on a big-ass screen that I'm
Oh, wow.
seeing. So the Chinese are way ahead of us in this regard. So you're kind of spot on there. Now, let me give you one other example of the me focus. All salespeople who know anything have heard how important the listening skill is. Agree? We've all heard this. And the late Zig Ziglar again used to say, use your mouth and ears in the proportion you've been given them. That is, listen twice as much as you talk. So we've all learned this. We now know the science behind it. If you can get another person talking about their background, their issues, their passion, how they started their company, how they got their job, more dopamine, serotonin, and oxytocin are released in their brain than during lovemaking or a great meal. So we now actually know the science behind why you should be a great listener. And of course, this means great salespeople need to be great researchers, great preparers. In other words, totally research the buyer before they interact with them.
Does the science translate from a high level of sticking a module on someone's head, measuring when the brain lights up with dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, as you mentioned then, John? Is the science trickle down from there as to then how to build good questions or structures of that? Or is that unmeasurable, if that makes sense?
Yes, there's been studies on that as well. What are the right questions? And how do you ask questions? I'll give you just a silly one. We've all kind of heard that you should take notes as a salesperson. For example, if you look at the great salespeople, they'll do three things when they're doing a needs analysis. One, they'll totally focus 100% on the buyer's point of view before they'll start talking about their stuff. Difficult. Two, they'll ask permission to take notes and take notes. And three, They'll summarize and feed it back until they've got it right. Now, let's just ask permission to take notes. Which would be better? Do you mind if I take a couple of notes? Or is it okay if I take a couple of notes? Well, if you ask, do you mind, the answer, and they want you to take notes, the answer is no. And now, yay, we get this first no and then down balanced their downside to no. So the answer is it okay? Because the answer is yes. And now we get our first yes in the staircase to yes.
And are the elite salespeople doing that purposefully, or are they doing that via habits from perhaps good feedback from previous conversations? This is something that I find a little bit like squirrely of how much of this is being super conscious of everything that comes out of your mouth and how much of it is for the elite salespeople just luck and happen chance that they say the right thing, they get a smile and a yes and a positive feedback, and then it loops from there.
Well, it's another great example of there's always been art to this. So we've tried various things. We've heard various things. We've listened to tapes. We've watched motivational speakers, been to sales training, and gotten advice from our sales manager. And most of it's pretty good. But now we know the science behind it. And so it isn't just happenstance anymore. We know exactly how to ask that question on, getting permission to take notes because we want the yes.
So I think you brought up perhaps an interesting training point here. How important is it to, perhaps read a book on sales? Clearly, we'll plug your book at the end of the show here, John. But how important is it to read books versus how important is it to spend time with great salespeople and just try and absorb what they're doing kind of day to day?
Well, let's drop back and look at books for a second. Now, if we go to the 6 whole brain stimuli, it's all about excitement, engagement, emotion. And we now know from these latest Harvard MRI studies, functional MRI studies, that the best way to wake up the buyer's little brain is with a customer story. And I'm sure you've heard this, the best salespeople, and actually the best executives too, are the best storytellers. And that is because we humans remember stories much more than we remember anything else. And so the great salespeople are the great storytellers. And therefore, if you read a book and it's all about the story of how salespeople have done stuff, that's what you remember. You don't actually remember the technique, but the story helps you remember the technique. Does that help?
That makes total sense. And just on this, because we've covered storytelling before on the show, but I'm always intrigued. I want to improve it myself from both a comedic standpoint for other kind of entertainment avenues that we're going on with different podcasts, but also to be able to better serve the audience. Are there any resources you can recommend for to learn to get better at storytelling?
Well, the latest studies from Harvard. So imagine a buyer in a chair with this functional MRI machine, and the researchers tell a story, a customer story, 10 different ways, 10 different architectures to the story. So they can see exactly what's the right architecture to best wake up the buyer's little brain. Would you like to hear an example?
Sure.
Okay. So, Will, let's say you're the running a mechanical contractor and I'm the sales guy. And I can say, Will, last year we worked for a company just like yours right outside of London. And Walt, the sales manager, told me that sales have been stagnant for 2 or 3 years. So I asked Walt, how many salespeople do you have? He said 21. I said, well, where'd they come from? He said, well, we've never really actually hired a salesperson. Most of our salespeople have come up through the customer service route. They've been field technicians. 3 of them are actually sheet metal benders who wanted to get into sales. So I said, so Walt, what's the sales aptitude of your sales force? He said, well, what do you mean by aptitude? What do you mean by aptitude? So we gave all of his sales guys an aptitude assessment. Few were high for aptitude, a few were low, most in the middle. In other words, his sales group has the sales aptitude of the general population, which of course is not what you want.
Yeah.
You would like to have most of your salespeople high or medium high. So we helped Walt restructure the sales force over 9 months. He ended up with 9 high aptitude, 7 with high moderate. Sales went up by 30%. And since he was getting more sales with less salespeople, gross margins went up by 70%. So now, if you really were running a mechanical contractor, about halfway through that story, your old brain is feeling like it's in the story. And near the end, your old brain's going, wow, I wonder if I could get those same results. So that's an example of the ultimate optimum story architecture from Harvard.
Because that ties back into the me element of this, and the even to confirmation bias. If you want to change that, and this is a ridiculous question, should everything we do be focused on getting the customer's mind to literally visualize them using us and feeling better for it? Is that can we dumb sales down into a sentence as simple as that?
Pretty much. Not like
We're done
that's
here,
the only
John.
sentence.
We've finished.
Pretty
That's
good.
the end of the podcast. That's the end of the show. No more podcast
Yes.
episodes.
Is it happy hour time yet?
Because I don't think most salespeople perhaps think like that. I don't think that's a mindset. That was off the top of my head there, that as I'm filtering and processing this, but that changes. That changes most sales training as well. Most of the feedback I get from the audience, 20 to 30,000 people listen to this episode, and more will listen over the years to come. Most of the feedback I get is we get too much product training, not enough speaking to people, communication, quote unquote sales training. But when we shift it into this element, I don't think there's many training companies, and you might have data on this, you might know otherwise, but I've never had sales training where it teaches us how to build a story, build imagination in someone's mind, build enough rapport that they'll sit with you for 10 minutes as you go through this. So is that what we should be focusing on? Should that be the top level of sales training, and then everything else comes underneath that?
I mean, I totally agree. And as I mentioned earlier, the great thing about understanding all this science, neuroscience, is in many cases it totally upsets what salespeople have thought was the right thing to do. So we've covered one already, and that is try to jam products down people's throat as opposed to tell a story about one of your customers. Another one we covered was always start presentations with the customer needs. Now, here's our understanding of your needs. So there's two right there that upset what salespeople think. Here's another couple of interesting ones. One is called a single option aversion bias. So one of the other main stimuli in our old brain is clear contrast. So for our old brain to make a decision, it needs to see a difference. And so if you only offer the buyer one option, the buyer, and this is multiple studies across 33 industries in the US, the closing rate is 10%. But if you offer the buyer two similar options, the closing rate goes to 64%. That's a difference in closing rate of 640%. So the bottom line is never only offer the buyer a single option. And even if you only sell one thing, you can still offer two versions. Now, there's a second bias that goes into this called the choice paradox bias. So the choice part of the choice paradox bias means many salespeople think if I can just get the customer to listen to all 7 of my solutions, one is bound to stick. The paradox part of the choice paradox bias goes back to the second old brain stimuli, keep it simple. If you give the buyer more than 3 options, their old brain becomes confused. And will a confused brain make a decision? We know no. So if you take the single option aversion bias and the choice paradox bias and combine them, never offer a single option nor more than 3. So the right answer is always offer the buyer 2 or 3 options. And you see it play out in real life, a lot. If you go to an upscale restaurant with your spouse or partner, anniversary dinner, and the restaurant has specials, they almost always have 2 or 3. It used to be, if you were my age buying a car 30 years ago, there was all these options to consider. Now only 2 or 3 packages. So there's something totally obsessed with salespeople think. One, if I can just show them everything we got, something's bound to stick. And we've only got one product. That's their only choice.
And that's that's like the bottom level of, or the end result of, if you are a true consultant, you're going to narrow down your product offering naturally because you're going to have had that conversation. You're going to have done that discovery. So again, we know we should be doing that. But then if And then if we're only offering one product, perhaps we've not done enough discovery, and we're not appreciating that the customer wants some kind of flexibility in there as well. So the science is almost proving what we know we should be doing but aren't doing anyway, right?
Totally agree. Totally agree. Here's another interesting one. Your company, and I'll pose this question to the audience. Your company and two others are after a hot opportunity, and you've all got to give a presentation in the same day to either a buyer or a group of buyers. And you have an inside coach, and she says, I can influence whether you present first, second, or third. So imagine which one you would like to be, first, second, or third. Now, if you ask, when you do surveys of salespeople in the U.S., 80% will say third. But because of the anchor bias, always go first. And the reason is when the buyers hear the first presentation, unless it's all hosed up, when they hear the first presentation, their old brain anchors on it. And when they hear the second and third, they don't try to do all this difficult, complex thinking to change their minds. They look for anything negative, remember the negativity bias, to get rid of it. So always prevent, if you can, always be the first to present. Now, there is an exception, and that is if the buying process is spread over months. Let's just say, Will, you're looking for a wealth advisor. You haven't had one yet. You want one. And you're going to talk to three of them. You're in no hurry. You're going to talk to three of them over the next several months. In that case, you want to be the last person to present to you. And the reason is it's been too long. So your old brain will have forgotten the anchor from the first one. So if it's all in the same time frame, always be the first to present. Totally upsets what most salespeople think.
John, have you read the books either, I think one's called Positioning or the other one's called, I think it's 22 Immutable Laws of Marketing. I think it's Eric Ries or something like that. Have you read those or either one of those?
I've read I've read 800 books. I know it sounds crazy, and most of them are sales and marketing.
Because a lot of what you're describing there are essentially principles from the book of essentially positioning yourself against the competition. It's better to be in your own subcategory rather than trying to chase the number one or the number two. And the reason I've got this stuff in my mind is we're launching a sales kind of a video product in a few weeks' time called the Sales School, relaunching it. And I'm doing everything I possibly can to position it against the kind of mainstream of sales training. And we're kind of coining it as self-development for salespeople rather than sales training for the corporate world. And we've got there's I don't want to pitch it to the audience kind of now in the show, but everything that we're describing here, all the psychological principles seem to be well covered in these books, marketing books that were written 20 years ago. Are marketers ahead of us in this game, and do we have something to learn from them, or is the kind of did they assume some of this and only now the science is catching up to prove the hypothesis?
I think marketing's been ahead of sales probably 10 to 15 years, I'm guessing. Remember neuromarketing when that came out?
Mm-hmm.
That was a huge, huge impact on the market. And a lot of that, not all of it, but a lot of this stuff is in neuromarketing.
So
yes, I think marketing's way ahead of sales in this area.
I'll ask you one final question before the final question, John, and that is there anything that we can learn from, it could be marketing, it could be HR, whoever, for outside of the world of sales? Is there any standout thing that's a high leverage point for us salespeople that we perhaps haven't considered, but other parts of a business have?
Do you mean outside the whole realm of neuroscience or anything?
Anything, I guess, just as broad and as wide and as someone as well read as you. Is there anything that salespeople should be considering that they don't, whereas kind of marketing, for example, do consider it?
So I'll give you one idea. When you read a lot of books about leadership and sales and look at the skills needed, the overlap, in my opinion, is 80%. An example is the storytelling. The great salespeople are the great storytellers. The great leaders are the great storytellers. So if you're going to be a great salesperson and you aspire to go up the ladder, sales manager, perhaps CEO, then all those skills apply. And this neuroscience, I got a whole section in it on how it applies to decision making in the corporate world. And a lot of it's the same as in sales. So that's one great thing about a sales career.
And
the possibilities are endless if you do well in sales.
For sure. I think it was Matt Cameron we had come on to describe the quickest way from going from zero, I don't want to say zero and kind of piss off the whole audience, but from salesperson to basically the show was from zero to CEO, and he reckoned sales and kind of leadership from that perspective was one of the quickest pathways to get there in the corporate world. So that ties in nicely, and which is awesome. And I appreciate that, John. And with that, mate, I've got one final question. And I ask this to everyone that comes on the show, and that is, if you could go back in time and speak to your younger self, the young John, what would you tell him that would help him become better at sales?
OMG. If I'd have known what I know now when I first started in sales, I'd have sold so much more. So my main advice is there's really 5 factors for success in sales, and you got to have all 5. 1 is strong product knowledge, kind of obvious. 2 is a natural talent for sales, easily measured by assessments. 3 is the selling skills, which we've really been talking about. 4 is self-motivated. And 5, working for a company that has best practice sales and marketing processes to support the salesperson. When you see all 5 of those, now we're talking.
And if you were in a computer game and you could add so many points to one of those attributes, say they're all 5 out of 10, and you could have another 3 or 4 attributes to one specific one, which one would be the one that you'd work on?
Well, aptitude, so big picture. Based on big studies, they call it meta-analysis of large studies, a summary of studies of HR and sales institutes, aptitude accounts for 50% of sales results. And a combination of the other 4 factors are the other 50%. So aptitude ain't everything, but if we're hiring salespeople without it, we're really tying one arm behind our back. And so if you're a salesperson and know your aptitude, let's just say it's moderately high, and you know your aptitude, you know your basic personality traits, and you learn to stretch when you need to, you can have a higher virtual aptitude than you've actually got. So that's like the first thing to work on is, who am I? How am I a fit for sales? Where am I not quite the best fit? And how can I stretch in those areas? And I'd say the second one to work on is product knowledge. Because if any of us deal with a salesperson, and it's pretty obvious after a few questions from us that they really don't know what they're talking about, we're not talking to them much longer. So product knowledge is pretty much binary, right? You've got to have it to be successful. And if you don't have it, it's pretty tough.
I love the description of it being binary. I am going to steal that for future use, John. And with that, mate, to wrap up, tell us about the book, Close Deals Faster, and where we can find out more about you as well, sir.
Well, you can go to our website, asherstrategies.com, and we train 70,000 salespeople in 22 countries, including UK. And the book's called Close Deals Faster. Came out about 6 months ago. The day it was available, it sold out on Amazon. Now, maybe there was only 3 copies available. But it's been just won an international book award as the best sales book of the year. And of all the books ever sold on Amazon, it's in the top 3%. So doing pretty well.
It's amazing stuff. We will link to the book, we'll link to your website, a few other things as well in the show notes to this episode over at salesman.org. And with that, John, I want to thank you for your time, mate. I really enjoyed this conversation. I don't know if you know this, the audience do. My background is in chemistry. I've got a degree there. So I love talking about all this stuff and nerding out, and we probably could have gone a whole lot deeper if we had another 4 hours to chat. So I appreciate that, mate. And I want to thank you for joining us on the Salesman Podcast.
You're welcome. And I'm a physicist. So yeah, we could have a great time.